Welcome to this new International Manifesto Group event, which is also sponsored by the Black Agenda for the Black Alliance for Peace, by the No Cold War campaign, the Tricontinental, and supported also by our media sponsor, the Canada Files. My name is Radhika Desai. I convene the International Manifesto Group. I teach politics here in Winnipeg, which stands on the stolen lands of many Indigenous peoples and of the Métis Nation. We're going to discuss why ending US aggression on Cuba is key to world peace, and to understand why we need to begin with the long and slow unraveling of US imperial policy and its visible acceleration at this very moment in Afghanistan. Running like a thread through all the presidencies of the so-called post-Cold War world, making them merge into one another as though they were a single one, this unraveling has delivered not unipolarity or a peace dividend, let alone the end of history that so many expected in the early 1990s, but multi and pluripolarity and unbridled unilateral military, economic, and generally hybrid aggression by the US around the world. This is all the more desperate for its awareness of the unraveling, and therefore it has also tended to fail more spectacularly. This process culminated in a manner of speaking in Trump's America First policies that replaced the more swaggering forms of US imperial policy in recent decades, such as Clinton's globalization or Bush Jr.'s empire. However, the military-industrial complex and the corporate elites who hope against hope to continue projecting US power around the world could hardly disappear overnight. So Trump also transformed Obama's pivot to Asia into a veritable new Cold War on China. The Biden administration inherited the schizophrenic policy. He was elected on a one-point platform to be the anti-Trump. He took office with a one-message mantra: America is back. 6 months later, it seems, however, that America is more on the back foot. Forced by economic realities and congressional and electoral realities, all created by the same imperial policies, Biden is continuing so many Trump-era policies that his administration is merging with the previous one into a single Trumpian presidency. Biden had agreed with Trump in ending the unpopular forever war. And during the campaign itself. And later, it also became clear that he would just carry out Trump's plan, only pushing the deadline back a few months. Biden expected a quick and easy and popular withdrawal, combined with a sweet deal with a puppet Ghani government, whoever remembers his name these days, to leave enough personnel there to cause problems for Russia and China. Instead, he has got the most humiliating US routes in Saigon, possibly more so, since the Taliban is a much less attractive force without superpower backing. 40 years of intervention, 20 years of fighting, and what does the US have to show for it? Everybody has been counting the cost, the lives lost, the treasure lost, the flood of refugees, the demonstrated failure in nation building, the demonstrated failure to train the Afghan army, loss of respect among allies, the international humiliation. But one element is very critical. It is the greater incoherence of American imperial policy than ever before. The Biden administration says it is withdrawing from Afghanistan so it can concentrate on its more important strategic competition with China and Russia. But has not the withdrawal made them stronger, more secure, and reduced the US ability to create trouble for them? The same combination of decline and desperation, the same incoherence also marks US aggression on the other side of the world. And that is why ending US aggression there against Cuba is also key to ending world peace, because that peace is endangered by nothing more than this out of control war machine. Biden promised to go back to Obama-era easing in Cuba, but the need to turn Florida Democratic and a divided Congress have forced Biden not only to keep hundreds of Trump-era sanctions, but to add more of his own. Then came the July protests, and Biden leaped at the opportunity he thought they offered. His Afghan policy was already wobbling, and Cuba was suffering. Though its world-renowned medical system had helped it to face the pandemic with great success, Trump's sanctions, with Biden's sanctions added to them, and the collapse of tourism were creating serious economic problems. So Biden thought, well, with a little cheerleading, considerable funding, and much provocation, he could perhaps turn these protests into an overthrow of communist rule. What could be easier? And what could bring more prestige? Cuba had, after all, been a thorn of a very special sort in the side of US imperial policy for over 6 decades. It demonstrated the limits of American imperial capacities right at its doorstep, even bringing the prospect of nuclear war there. At one point, it was doing so even after losing US Soviet backing in the early 1990s. It was penetrating American domestic politics. Next to Israel, perhaps the lobby in Miami is the strongest in American politics. And it was inspiring the rest of Latin America, let alone the world. Latin America has the proverbial empire's workshop and the backyard of the United States. Now, I'm going to leave it to our panelists to tell you why Biden's ploy is already failing and why Cuba will yet again prove to be the little revolution that could. So let me start by introducing the first of them. We have had to record Ariel Sanchez's contribution, thanks to the very US sanctions we will discuss. They include denying Cubans access to Zoom. And we should add that our audience in Cuba is joining us through YouTube for the same reason. So let me now introduce Iroel Sanchez. Iroel Sanchez is based in Havana. He has a degree in computer engineering from the Universidad Tecnológica de La Habana, and he is the director of Casa Editora Abril and president of the Cuban Book Institute. From 2000 to 2009, he chaired the organizing committee of the Havana Book Fair. He's the founder of La Jiribilla Cultural Journal. He founded and coordinates the development of EcuRaid, collaborative encyclopedia, which is the Cuban version of Wikipedia. He edits La Pupila Insomne, one of the most widely read blogs in Cuba. He's a member of the Cuban Journalists Union and has sat on the International Committee of the World Gathering of Bloggers. He has lectured in Cuba, in Spain, in Brazil, and Venezuela, and spoken at international communication and computer science events in Latin America and Cuba. He's a regular contributor to Telesur, Al Mayadin, and Russia Today. And he directs the television program La Pupila Asombrada. So, Paul, would you please play the recording that we have of Iroel's talk? You have to turn the sound on. Paul, can you do it?
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. We couldn't hear the video sound.
Okay, can you see Ariel?
Yes.
Okay, here we go.
Still can't hear him.
Okay, well, I've got the, oh, okay, wait a second.
Helen Yaffe says, go back to the share screen option and click share computer sound at the bottom left.
Try it now.
Okay, try. Paul?
You have to hit play.
Sorry?
He has to hit play.
Yeah, he has, well, I'm sure he knows that. I don't know what's going on. Paul?
Radhika, it's Carlos. Do you want me to try?
Yes, please.
Muchas gracias, es un placer poder
And
estar
you
en
have to turn on the CC so the subtitles can be seen.
dar un serio sobre los últimos acontecimientos en nuestro país. Alrededor del 11 de julio se ha hablado mucho, pero sería bueno partir de que lo que ahí sucedió no es el resultado de procesos inmediatamente cercanos, sino de la acumulación en dos direcciones de igualmente procesos que se han venido incubando en la sociedad cubana. Por un lado, el deterioro de las condiciones materiales de existencia de la inmensa mayoría de la población por la interrelación entre dos elementos, el recrudecimiento sin precedentes de la agresión económica por parte del gobierno americano, que, como es conocido, durante el mandato de Trump, implementó más de 240 nuevas medidas contra la economía cubana y el impacto de la pandemia, que en el caso particular de Cuba, vino a prácticamente paralizar uno de los principales renglones del país, que es el turismo. Y bueno, en el caso de estas medidas de Trump, han ido contra uno de los principales, otro de los principales ingresos del país, el principal, que es la exportación de servicios médicos, persiguiendo la factura. Esto ha provocado importantes carencias durante el mandato de Trump. Implementó más de 240 nuevas medidas de una pandemia y las restricciones para la generación de energía a partir de
Radhika, I think this has to be started all over again. It's terrible.
Yeah,
It was
Carlos,
per-
can you?
It was perfect before, the sound and the captions, and now I don't know what happened.
Yeah, Carlos, can you hear us? Can you start it again, please? With the sound, because there is no sound right now, because remember, some people are watching on YouTube and they will need the sound if they are Spanish speakers.
Muchas gracias, es un placer poder estar en este espacio y poder desde Cuba dar un criterio sobre los últimos acontecimientos en nuestro país. Alrededor del 11 de julio se ha hablado mucho, pero sería bueno partir de que lo que ahí sucedió no es el resultado de procesos inmediatamente cercanos, sino de la acumulación en dos direcciones de igualmente procesos que se han venido incubando en la sociedad cubana. Por un lado, el deterioro de las condiciones materiales de existencia de la inmensa mayoría de la población por la interrelación entre dos elementos, el recrudecimiento sin precedentes de la agresión económica por parte del gobierno norteamericano, que, como es conocido, durante el mandato de Trump implementó más de 240 nuevas medidas contra la economía cubana y el impacto de la pandemia, que en el caso particular de Cuba vino a prácticamente paralizar uno de los principales renglones económicos del país, que es el turismo. Y bueno, en el caso de estas medidas de Trump han ido contra otro de los principales ingresos del país, el principal, que es la exportación de servicios médicos, persiguiéndola por todo el mundo. Esto ha provocado importantes carencias en tres direcciones fundamentales: el abastecimiento de alimentos, el abastecimiento de medicamentos en medio de una pandemia y las restricciones para la generación de energía a partir de que también se han reducido las importaciones de combustibles, no solo por la disponibilidad de divisas, sino también por el encarecimiento a partir de las medidas contra las navieras que transportan ese combustible a Cuba por la política de Estados Unidos. En otra dirección, se ha venido incrementando de modo sostenido el financiamiento para la subversión en el país, ya desde época de Obama. Pudiéramos decir que hay dos grupos de medios de comunicación y de activismos digitales financiados de Estados Unidos, pudiéramos decir, dirigido específicamente a sectores de gran influencia en la sociedad cubana, a partir de minorías como son intelectuales, académicos, periodistas, artistas, cuya mayoría sigue junto al proceso revolucionario, pero Estados Unidos ha logrado construir una cabeza de playa en esos sectores en Cuba, a partir de publicaciones que han generado un interés de una microclase atada a ellos, que tiene su modo de vida atado a esos ingresos provenientes de la subversión. Y por otra parte, los medios de agitación política que crecieron mucho, existían desde antes de la etapa de Obama, pero crecieron mucho en la etapa de Trump, que no son, pudiéramos decir, actuaciones independientes, sino unos generan los estados de provocación para que los otros propongan las soluciones, pudiéramos llamar pacíficas, ¿no? O académicas o intelectuales, entre comillas, a lo que los otros generan, ¿no? La violencia, las provocaciones, eso pasó, por ejemplo, con la llamada articulación plebeya, surgida después del fracaso del golpe blando del 27 de noviembre, instigado desde un movimiento llamado Movimiento San Isidro, que, como se supo después, tenía vínculos directos con la Embajada de los Estados Unidos. El encargado de negocios les hacía de taxista, estaba allí controlando sus movimientos sobre el terreno, etc. Y también conectados con el financiamiento de los Estados Unidos, porque se revelaron contratos con dinero de la net de más de $1,000 mensuales a algunas de estas personas. También durante la pandemia, por supuesto, se han desactivado las redes estudiantiles, educacionales. Ahí el curso escolar está suspendido hace año y medio en Cuba, y en Cuba eso tiene una importancia enorme porque es universal. Prácticamente es obligatoria, prácticamente no es obligatoria la enseñanza hasta los 9 grados, y prácticamente todos los jóvenes menores de 18 años están en su inmensa mayoría o estudiando en los niveles de educación media superior, estudiando en la universidad. Y todo eso se desactivó, junto con un deterioro de las redes barriales de organizaciones sociales, como la Federación de Mujeres Cubanas, los comités de defensa de la revolución, ese tejido histórico de la revolución que ha venido, es reconocido así por los documentos del propio partido, sufriendo un deterioro en su activismo, y también las propias estructuras de los delegados del Poder Popular. Durante este año y medio tampoco ha habido asambleas de rendición de cuentas del Poder Popular que se hacen sistemáticamente cada 2 meses para que los ciudadanos ventilen sus inquietudes, reclamen soluciones, exijan respuestas. Eso también se ha desactivado durante todo este tiempo de pandemia y no ha sido sustituido con otras vías. ¿Con qué ha sido sustituido? Con estas personas que pertenecen a todas estas redes deterioradas o desactivadas, están, sobre todo los jóvenes, cada vez más tiempo en internet, cada vez más tiempo en las redes sociales digitales. Desde finales de 2018 hay datos móviles en los teléfonos que aceleran todos estos procesos y están sometidas a todo este bombardeo desde los Estados Unidos, financiado a través de todos estos agitadores políticos, todos estos sitios de agitación política. Toda esta combinación junto con algo que el propio gobierno revolucionario, el propio presidente Miguel Díaz-Canel reconoció inmediatamente después del 11 de julio, que es la desactivación de un grupo de programas sociales que Fidel impulsó durante lo que se llamó la batalla de ideas, dígase los trabajadores sociales, los instructores de arte, los programas de superación para jóvenes, que se impulsaron un grupo de transformaciones económicas, pero estos programas en medio de esas transformaciones, lejos de ser menos necesarios, son más necesarios. Y no se siguieron acometiendo, aunque sí están presentes las atenciones sociales, la seguridad social, siguen estando presentes en las políticas del Estado cubano, esa filosofía de reconectar a los sectores vulnerables con las instituciones y con los programas del socialismo, porque están en desventaja. Hay igualdad de oportunidades, pero no hay igualdad de condiciones en esos sectores para aprovechar esas oportunidades, que fue de lo que Fidel se percató. También este bombardeo subversivo, este deterioro de las condiciones materiales de existencia, no se cuenta con esos programas que fueran un atenuante. Pero si bien es cierto todo esto, también esto no sirve para decir lo que ha dicho el presidente norteamericano de que Cuba es un estado fallido, porque precisamente han hecho falta 243 medidas de restricciones, aún más del bloqueo que impuso Trump y que Biden ha mantenido. Ha hecho falta una pandemia que pone a Cuba en más desventaja que cualquier otro país del mundo para enfrentar, y sin embargo Cuba lo ha hecho con uno de los menores índices de letalidad del mundo frente a la pandemia, y lo ha hecho desarrollando hasta sus propias vacunas para enfrentar, y ya tiene 3 vacunas certificadas para uso de emergencia. Y Cuba acaba, por ejemplo, de acordar con Vietnam un suministro de vacunas a un país de más de 90 millones de habitantes. Todo esto indica que a Estados Unidos se le ha ido el tren en que creyó montarse el 11 de julio. Y todo esto que vemos después es la retórica para mantener viva y contenta a esa minoría extremista de Miami, que incapaz de mantener las protestas en Cuba, las hace en Miami, no sobre el terreno de Cuba, porque ya perdió la oportunidad, el tren se le fue. Y Biden, que tiene con esta fantasía, esta pantomima de dar internet ficticia libre a los cubanos, que es la misma ficción con que trataron de dar televisión Martí, y han invertido cientos y cientos de millones con dinero de los estadounidenses para una televisión que no se ve, lo mismo que va a pasar. Creo que ellos están viendo que se les escapa el tiempo, están desesperados, fracasaron en la maniobra internacional, fracasaron en la OEA, fracasaron con sus aliados, solo consiguieron el apoyo de 20 países, entre los cuales están grandes violadores de los derechos humanos como Honduras, Colombia, Israel, para una maniobra anticubana. Creo que en toda la línea están desacreditados y frustrados en esta agresión. Lo que le queda es complacer a esta minoría extremista en Miami, y yo creo que estamos asistiendo a, eso sí, una vez más, un intento fallido de derrocar la revolución cubana, que todavía tiene muchos desafíos por delante, tiene grandes problemas que enfrentar, pero yo creo que la manera en que está actuando hoy el gobierno cubano, yendo a sus bases, dialogando y renovando las estructuras sociales creadas por la revolución, movilizando a los jóvenes alrededor de las soluciones de estos problemas, el camino para enfrentar estas agresiones, y también adquiriendo una cultura crítica para comprender a nivel popular todas estas maniobras mediáticas y todos estos procesos de las redes sociales. Pero el gobierno cubano no le ha temido a eso. El gobierno cubano, después del 11 de julio, bajó los precios del acceso a internet, hizo nuevas ofertas. Ese es el gobierno que Biden dice que le tiene miedo a la internet. Internet que ellos han limitado para Cuba, incluso impidiéndole conectar a las decenas de cables submarinos que pasan a muy pocas costas de la isla, y que Cuba tuvo que traer la internet con un cable desde Venezuela por más de 1000 kilómetros porque Estados Unidos le impidió conectarse a eso. Esas son las verdades que esta maniobra mediática de guerra psicológica en las redes sociales no quiere que se conozcan. Un saludo a todos y muchas gracias por la invitación y muchas gracias por este espacio para hablar de lo que sucede en Cuba con la verdad. Gracias.
Radhika, you're muted.
Thank you very much to Ariel Sanchez for giving us that very measured hope, very realistic hope, and telling us exactly what makes the Cuban Revolution so resilient. Our next speaker, and please let me say a couple of things. I'm sorry about the chat, and of course there will not be any subtitles anymore, but if you would like to have just so you know, if you open the chat box, it no longer gives those pop-up windows that stop subtitles. Secondly, please wait until the question and answer session to raise your hand. Okay, so now we will go to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Carlos Ron, and he is the Vice Minister for North America in the Ministry of People's Power for Foreign Relations in Venezuela. And he is also there, the president of the Simon Bolivar Institute for Peace and Solidarity Among Peoples. Carlos was born in Venezuela, and there he has been raised and educated also in Brazil. As a diplomat, he has represented Venezuela in the United States as well as in Brazil. He was an advisor to the Office of Presidential International Relations, coordinator of the research program on regional integration and multilateral agreements at the Miranda International Center. Carlos has studied in the United States and in Brazil. So Carlos, we are very honored to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Radhika, and it's a pleasure to be here, and it's always a pleasure, of course, to be somewhere where we can speak out and defend our brothers and sisters of Cuba and the Cuban Revolution. You know, it is interesting that you well, when we gathered under this for this event, we were talking about U.S. aggression being a danger for world peace, and I would say, you know, it really, the aggression against Cuba is part of a hybrid war that is ongoing already, and then we have to, even though, you know, there's no troops being deployed in Cuba and there's no bombs falling from U.S. planes, well, we have a very a situation that is exactly the same as a war, and exactly the same with the same capacity of creating pain, and is aimed at creating pain, and is aimed specifically at creating a change of government in Cuba, as well as other countries that are undergoing the same type of blockade as we are here in Venezuela. And as other countries, about 30% of the world is under some sort of illegal, unilateral, coercive measure by the United States. This puts into question our whole international system, where, as we know, the only actions that we can call sanctions can be issued by the United Nations Security Council. Yet the United States feels that they have the right and that they have the duty to place these actions or these measures on free countries and free peoples, punishing whole populations with the effect of their measures. So we have to keep this in mind. We have to keep in mind that the aggression of the United States against Cuba in recent weeks, as Iroel very well described, you know, has been, if we could put a number to it, you know, in the last 16 weeks, there have been over 52 U.S. sanctions implemented against Cuba alone. So this is the barbarity, and this is the mass, you know, how massive this attack and this war is actually going on against Cuba. Look, I live in a city that, and with this I want to say what Cuba means to me, and I know that it means the same to many Venezuelans. I live in a city that around 20 years ago, began to change. I could walk across from my street and begin to distinctly hear the Cuban accent next to the National Institute of Sports when we began the cooperation. I could walk further up the hill into one of the poorest neighborhoods here in Caracas, and I could also start hearing a Cuban accent for the first time at the post that President Chavez set up. So for the first time in the lives of many of the people that live here, they had access to a doctor. They had a doctor nearby. Back then, a lot of people who started questioning this relationship between Venezuela and Cuba began saying, why aren't Venezuelan doctors occupying this post? Why aren't they the ones to take care of the people? And the reality was that there was a call by the government for Venezuelan doctors to go into the inner city places and to go into the remote rural areas of Venezuela. And they wouldn't go because they said things like, these places are very dangerous. These places are not safe. We're not going to get paid enough money to do this. I don't want to risk my life for so little money and so forth. And the Cuban doctors militantly and with commitment came and gave these people, the first medical attention they had in years, sometimes in generations, because there have been generations that haven't had this access. The irony of this is that those Cuban doctors that came to live in these poor areas of the city became the most respected, the most protected people in the area because of the gratitude of the people, when the solidarity of the Cuban doctors who didn't think twice about staying in that part of the city, living with the population under the conditions that the population was living in those parts of the inner cities. By the way, I saw this in Brazil as well with the program Mais Médicos that was implemented under the Workers' Party that the right wing supported by the U.S. eventually overthrew. It is. And I'll tell you even more. This unmistakable Cuban accent that we started listening to here, we also heard it in other parts of the country with people that started to read and write for the first time in their lives, thanks to the Cuban brigades that came over and helped erase literacy from Venezuela by alphabetizing over 1 million people. This, my friends, is not something that you read in a book. This is not something you hear in a speech. It's not some report. This is something that we have witnessed here in Venezuela for over 20 years. This is what Cuba means to us. It means humanity. It means solidarity. It is a people whose history is inextricably linked to our own. Cuba was the last mission, the last unfulfilled mission in Bolivar's agenda of liberation for this continent. There's a beautiful flag that I invite you to look for, created by Bolivarians, of a golden sun on a blue background and a red outline that was supposed to be the flag of Cuban independence in 1823, and those efforts been successful. Cuba has been on the list of priorities for Latin American emancipation ever since 1826, and we finally came to see in an emancipated and free and strong Cuba with the Cuban Revolution, with Fidel Castro. 2 weeks after coming to Havana, he came here to Caracas, and you could read Pablo Neruda's account on watching Fidel's speech for over 200,000 people here in Caracas, and how he said that he had heard something different from a politician, something that was lively within the people of Caracas, because it was to him the opening of a new era for Latin America. That stayed in generations, in the memories of the Venezuelans who have fought very hard during our so-called democracy at that time, until it became a real democracy in the Bolivarian Revolution, and now we can share the same message that Fidel gave of solidarity, of coherence, and of dignified living for the majorities of population. What we share with Cuba today is that same horizon of social justice. We walk together in a valley of sabotage and aggression and blockades and unilateral measures, all aimed at destroying viable socialist experiences as close as 90 miles from the shores of the place that would have you believe that you have reached Dante's neoliberal inferno and that we almost abandon hope for a different society. We're not abandoning hope. We are not abandoning Cuba. Cuba, to me and to most of Venezuelans, it's not only the victorious entry of the revolutionaries in Havana, but it's the remarkable achievements of its people, despite all the aggressions that they undergo. Like Iroel said, you have a country who has by now 5 vaccine candidates of its own, despite all the aggression, despite all the limitations that it has. Yet it doesn't have enough syringes to put them on its own people because of this attacks that the United States is placing on them. So Cuba is that resistance, that love, that commitment to a socialist future, which is present in the consciousness of those youth who today will come out with their head high and proud and will say to you, we are Fidel, or will say to you, patria muerte venceremos. So this is the Cuba that we defend. This is the Cuba that we stand firmly next to. And we must all do our efforts to denounce this illegal and arbitrary aggression of the United States against all countries that it is trying to destroy and overthrow, because we are building a socialist horizon that they are afraid of. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos. A very important words, I think, from someone who is on the front lines of fighting American imperialism. I found it very interesting, your statistic, the statistic that you gave, which is that about 30% of the world's population is suffering under some or the other form of US sanctions. I think that is a very telling statistic. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Chris Hazzard. Chris is an Irish Sinn Fein politician and has been a member of parliament for South Down since the 27th. Sorry, can somebody please mute this? Okay. All right. Chris has been an MP since 2017. He was the member of the Legislative Assembly of Northern Ireland for the South Down constituency from April 2012. And then at that time, he was also Minister for Infrastructure in Northern Ireland until from May 2016 till the executive's collapse in January 2017. He's a passionate advocate for rural Ireland, and has been a signatory to the open letter entitled Let Cuba Live, which appeared in the New York Times, calling for an end to sanctions on Cuba. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Radhika, for your kind introduction and to the organizers for the invite to participate in this event today. It's a real privilege to share a panel with some really distinguished speakers here today and political activists here at the forefront of standing up for ordinary people against imperialist aggression, not just in Cuba, but of course throughout Latin America and indeed across the world. I suppose the fundamental question I want to address in today's discussion is, why has the US deployed aggression against Cuba? Others in this panel are much better placed to illustrate how this aggression has manifested across the last 6 decades. So I will certainly give the floor to them on that. Secondly, in reference to the title of today's event, I also want to address why I believe the US has no interest in world peace, but rather the maintenance of its hegemony as the unipolar superpower of our time. And as a result of this imperialism, many countries will continue to face persistent political meddling, cruel economic sanctions, hybrid warfare, and even outright obliteration. So why attack Cuba? Well, quite simply, the Cuban Revolution presents an alternative world vision that challenges the hegemony of neoliberal capitalist system, and there's therefore not acceptable to US imperial interests. As a result, Cuba has endured 6 decades of relentless hostility, including embargo, economic sanction, invasion, occupation of Guantanamo, the fermenting of domestic terrorism, and more than 600 assassination attempts from Fidel Castro. However, it's important to recall that Cuba's revolution was not the Kremlin-inspired communist plot often portrayed in mainstream liberal narratives. Indeed, this is evident if you examine the core message of Fidel's first declaration of Havana in 1960, where concepts such as national sovereignty, democracy, and the national self-determination of Latin American countries provided a constant thread. Even Che Guevara was still promoting the need for Cuba to build an economic management system distinct from the Soviet manual of political economy in the mid-1960s. So one of the defining characteristics then of the Cuban revolutionary movement was the fact that despite the retrospective application of the communist label, it was in fact a multi-class rejection of the corrupt Batista regime, but perhaps most importantly, it was a popular uprising against the entrenched inequality, the persistent poverty and endemic racism that existed as a result of the oppressive quasi-colonial relationship with the US. As Helen, who's on this panel here today, has highlighted in her recent work, it's clear from the internal memos from the early 1960s that Cuba was keen to develop trade and investment opportunities with the rest of the world at that time, but the US intimidated and controlled a number of states around the world to ensure that they abandoned any such plan. US President John F. Kennedy then asked his brother Bobby to bring the terrors of the earth to bear on Cuba, as White House memos from both the Kennedy and Johnson era revealed that successive US administrations were deeply concerned in respect of Cuba's, and I quote, successful defiance of US policies and interests in the region dating back to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. It was feared then that Cuba's successful defiance might once again encourage other Latin American peoples suffering comparable conditions to pursue a similar path of revolution. For that reason then, successive US administrations have been wedded to the belief that it is necessary to punish the Cuban civilian population severely until they rise against their own government. And so for 6 decades, aggression has reigned. Central to this aggression has been a complex set of economic sanctions and financial embargoes that have been designed and implemented as collective punishment of the Cuban people, a war crime made possible not merely by US military power, but the imperialist construction of a global trade and finance system through US-dominated institutions in the wake of Bretton Woods in 1944. In recent decades, we've also seen the deadly consequence of such indiscriminate economic sanctions on the civilian populations in Iraq, and more recently in Iran and Venezuela, as we've just heard. In Iran, sanctions have undermined the government's ability to purchase many products, including vital medical supplies, which has had huge ramifications for Iran's universal public health system. In Venezuela, Donald Trump stiffened sanctions first imposed by Obama by targeting the Venezuelan oil industry in 2017, causing a loss of $6 billion within the first 12 months alone. Crucially, this loss of hard currency consequently harmed Venezuela's ability to pay for imports. Like Iran, the impact on medicine imports was especially destructive. In 2013, Venezuela was importing approximately $2 billion in medicines. By 2018, however, that had fallen drastically to just $140 million. The inevitable result of this has been the death of many thousands of Venezuelan citizens. Indeed, as US economist Jeffrey Sachs has illustrated, there was a 31% increase in general mortality in Venezuela in the 17-18 period. That's approximately an additional 40,000 deaths. There's little doubt that these sanctions were the direct cause of many of these deaths, and that numerous high-ranking US officials should today be in jail for murder, as these sanctions are nothing short of crimes against humanity. The ongoing embargo and unilateral sanctions against these countries and their civilian populations, especially in light of COVID, is a war crime. Let's make no mistake about that. Yet, despite repeated warnings from the UN and the International Court of Justice ruling in 2020 against the US in favor of Iran, the new Joe Biden administration has shown no appetite for loosening the noose. Indeed, as was seen earlier this summer, Biden has introduced a further 4 sets of sanctions against Cuba, despite his campaign promises to repeal many of the 240 odd sanctions introduced under Donald Trump. And of course, Biden has been able to break his campaign pledges by sticking to the well-established imperialist tactic of inventing a false narrative to justify illegal actions for a domestic audience. So where it was first fighting communism, then it was the war on drugs, then we had the war on terror, now we have the new Trojan horse of humanitarianism and human rights. Alan MacLeod, in fact, published a striking article earlier this year on how corporate media in particular uses language to encourage elements within the left political spectrum to support imperialist wars and intervention. MacLeod identified 1, the plight of women, 2, attacking his own people, 3, saving democracy, and 4, human rights as the core arguments now advanced by corporate media in the service of imperialist ambitions. Indeed, Libya is a case in point, where a bombing campaign was sold by corporate media in Europe and the US as a necessary humanitarian intervention. Yet the attacks obliterated most of Libya's infrastructure and killed more than 10,000 people. What it had, of course, provoked intervention was Gaddafi's long record of defying US imperialism in Africa, particularly his success in defying US attempts to establish Africa Command headquarters on the continent in 2006. So despite the humanitarian narrative spun by the mainstream media, the primary motivation for the US and NATO to overthrow Gaddafi was the US determination to establish and maintain a military and economic hegemony over Africa. It's worth noting that the HQ for AfricaCom is still in Stuttgart in Germany, as resistance among African nations has only grown since the Libyan intervention. In Afghanistan too, despite the dominant narrative, humanitarian concerns were, according to at least one senior British intelligence official from the time, much less significant than other factors. And I quote, "The human rights side only became part of the public rationale in order for the government to get the Guardian readers of the world on board." And as for the US and their allies being involved in a war for democracy in Afghanistan, they were in fact propping up one of the most corrupt regimes in the world, whose troops and police ruthlessly robbed and pillaged their own people, and whose president only remained in power because of the massive electoral fraud during the 2009 presidential election. Indeed, even ex-CIA Director David Petraeus probably identified the key driver recently in an online discussion with NATO's Atlantic Council, when he acknowledged that the US were acutely aware that there was approximately $2 trillion worth of minerals in Afghanistan, including lithium, rare earth, and all the other minerals that are in such demand. Finally, I think it's important to look at another campaign promise that President Biden has ignored, that of putting together the most diverse team in history. In fact, he has appointed a decision-making team of mostly professional class people, the great majority of whom are connected to the US plutocracy through participation in leading think tanks, such as the Council on Foreign Relations. There can be no doubt then that we have the US led once again by an elite that will strive to maintain neoliberalism and US hegemony on the world stage. For those who have never heard of the Council, it is the most important US policy think tank, which has set US grand strategy for over a century and at all times promoting US imperialism. It is unquestionably the most powerful private organization in the world, the internal hub of US monopoly finance capital, providing a networking and agenda-setting forum for the capitalist class. As Lawrence Shoup has revealed in a recent monthly review article, no less than 17 Biden team members are members of or have close family ties to the Council, including Vice President Harris, Secretary of State Blinken, Treasury Secretary Yellen, Climate Envoy John Kerry, CIA Director William J. Burns, and the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, to name but a few. Since the Second World War, the Council has been vital in setting out the imperial strategy for US involvement in every one of its major wars. Alarmingly, in the last few years, the Council has been setting out an aggressive new strategy towards China, with a recurring theme centering on the need for a, quote, a less cooperative, more confrontational US policy to block China, even if it creates, and I quote again, dangerous circumstances. In other words, it is clear that the Council believes it is now worth risking a catastrophic war to maintain US hegemony. If indeed the Council, and by extension, President Biden's team, or whoever indeed succeeds him, remains focused on global domination at the expense of building a truly multipolar international community, or indeed the urgency of ecological sustainability, there is precious little hope then of world peace, as we will slide further into the inevitable collapse of human civilization as we know it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Chris, for really underlining the moral repugnance of American imperial policy, the institutions that make it and the dangers that it represents. Our next speaker is Helen Yaffe. Helen is a senior lecturer in economic and social history at the University of Glasgow and visiting fellow at the Latin American and Caribbean Center at the London School of Economics. Cuba and Latin America are her specialties, and since 1995, she spent a lot of time living and researching in Cuba. She's also a founding member of Rock Against the Blockade, a British campaign for solidarity with Cuba. She wrote the book, We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World, which was published by Yale University Press in 2020. And previous to that, she wrote Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2009. Helen, we are eager to hear your words.
Thank you very much. Can I start by thanking the organisers and Radhika for the invitation? And it's a great panel of speakers. Already, many important themes have been touched on, and I haven't pre-prepared something, and I'm sort of not quite sure the direction I'm going to take this in, because there is so much to say, and it's also very difficult to know, as someone who's a historian and I teach courses on Cuba, the level of background knowledge. And Chris has given us a great history lesson. I totally wanted to pick up on things that Carlos was saying, because I was in Venezuela. I went into Barrio 23, one of the poor neighborhoods that he was talking about, and saw a Cuban doctor's surgery. I knew Cuban doctors who left behind their own children to go and serve on internationalist missions in Venezuela and all over the world. So I want to start by drawing this back to the title of the event: Ending US Aggression on Cuba is Key to World Peace, because many of you here will be activists and will know this slogan: no justice, no peace. And of course, a key tenet at the core of the Cuban Revolution is this demand for social justice with sovereignty. So the deep roots of anti-imperialism in the Cuban Revolution should never be underestimated, and nor should the importance and the pivotal role of the struggle for social justice. And this is actually, as others have outlined, Cuba's great crime, because Cuba shows that in order to achieve social justice in underdeveloped countries, and I use that term underdeveloped rather than developing very consciously, countries subjected to hundreds of years of colonialism and then imperialism, in order to attain social justice, they have to take an anti-imperialist position. In other words, they have to block the exploitation and oppression that leads to the high standard of living that the majority of populations enjoy in the imperialist countries. And we have to also be clear that we're not just talking about the United States. We're talking about complicity from all the imperialist countries, not just in relation to Cuba. That certainly has been there, and the fascinating documents are there about the pressure that was applied by the White House, by the presidential office in the early 1960s to insist that the British government didn't, for example, go ahead with the sale of Leyland buses and help to support to basically make sanctions effective on Cuba. So that's one thing. Let's also just, very briefly going back to history, what is the function of sanctions? Now, I've just written a chapter about the sanctions, the history of US sanctions on Cuba, for a book called Sanctions as War. And it's actually about the sanctions against, people have been talking about 1/3 of the world has unilateral sanctions imposed by the United States. So we have to understand these as a weapon of war, because when you deny people access to basic resources that they need to live, then you are targeting civilians, and that is certainly the case on Cuba. What is the function of sanctions? Now, I've repeated this a few times and in articles, but I think it's really important to go back to this key pivotal document written by Lester Mallory, an advisor to the Office of Hemispheric Affairs or whatever it was, when they were developing their new Cuba policy, more than a year before Fidel Castro made the announcement that this is a socialist revolution. More than a year before that, before the mass nationalizations, which are used as the pretext and the excuse for why the United States sanctions Cuba. And what he said on the 6th of April, 1960, in this secret memorandum, is we recognize that Fidel has great popularity among the Cuban people. We recognize that the communists are gaining influence. The revolution is moving left. And we can't see any opening to develop an internal opposition. And any attempt to invade or come in from outside will be rejected. In fact, that is what happened. They did go ahead with the Bay of Pigs and the CIA training the invaders and so on. But they said, what we need to do is essentially break the link between the population and the government. And we have to do that by using all the measures, economic measures at our disposal to create hardships and suffering. He used the word hunger and desperation. Why? In order to attain the ultimate objective, overthrow of government, i.e. regime change. And now if we fast forward to the Trump era and the Biden era that we're in now, what we can see is that the 243 actions, sanctions, and measures implemented by the Trump administration are a contemporary manifestation of those economic measures. But the other aspect, because this is a two-track policy, use economic asphyxiation to create hardship, to create frustration, discontent, and at the same time to do everything you can to foster an internal opposition movement. And so the new social media war on Cuba, which is very important that we understand that this is an orchestrated, well-funded, well-oiled campaign. It is a strategy of the regime change programs, that this is the other aspect of the contemporary effort at the two-track policy. Create economic hardship and foster an internal opposition. So this is what this is about. I want to say something else about the question of world peace, and I'm aware that I only have 10 minutes. So when, Carlos was talking about the beneficiaries in Venezuela, as I said, I've seen that. I've been in the barrios myself. But, in Venezuela, the Cuban doctors who poured into Venezuela, at one point reaching 28,000 medical staff present in Venezuela, that was the first time that many people had noticed Cuban medical internationalism. But let me tell you some incredible figures. Other people noticed a little bit later with Ebola in West Africa in 2014, or perhaps earlier, when the devastating earthquake happened in Haiti, with a possibly estimated 250,000 people killed in the first instance, let alone the consequences of that. But by 2014, we can say, and I'm reading from my book, which has a chapter on Cuban medical internationalism, literally millions of lives have been saved and hundreds of millions of lives improved. That is not an exaggeration. By the Ebola outbreak in 2014, Cuban medical professionals had performed 1.2 billion consultations overseas, attended 2.2 million births, and performed over 8 million surgeries. More than 4,000 Cuban medical professionals had over half of them doctors were already working in 32 African countries at that time. And some 76,000 Cuban medical personnel had already worked in 39 African countries since the 1960s. So when we talk about peace and the need to stop US aggression on Cuba in order to attain peace, we are also talking about the Cuban Revolution and what it has done for its investments in education and healthcare for the rest of the world. The internationalism of the Cuban Revolution, which has seen millions of beneficiaries around the world. And even when COVID-19 happened, the rest of the world, I remember, I'm sure you do, the images from Lombardy in Italy when it was the epicenter of the pandemic. And they were saying, where is the European Union? Where is our help? Everyone ran away, but the Cubans ran to the epicenter of the pandemic at that point, just as they had done in West Africa and just as they had done in Haiti, and are once again doing again with the new scenario in Haiti. So I'll stop there. I hope in the discussion we can focus a little bit on what we can do to combat, if not stop, US aggression against Cuba.
Thanks so much, Helen. Energizing as usual. Our next speaker is Arnold August. Arnold is based in Montreal. He's an author and journalist who has written 3 books on Cuba. Democracy in Cuba and the 1997-98 elections, Cuba and its neighbors, Democracy in Motion, and Cuba-US relations. And these books have been much praised and much relied on by activists and scholars around the world. Arnold's journalism has won a lot of awards, and it is published in English, Spanish, and French in North and South America, Europe, and the Middle East. So Arnold, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Radhika. In our appeal for today's event, we indicate very clearly that we stand against the color revolution, or more precisely, color counter-revolution, as an integral part of US aggression against Cuba and thus endangering world peace. Now, I would like to just give one example, my example from Canada, about this issue of support for counter-revolution. But before saying so, I think it's important to take into account, once again, that on July 11th and 12th, there was very important violent activities that took place, plunder, looting, even attacks against state health facilities. This took place on July 11th and 12th. Now, let's get one other point. Of course, there are other factors that played into the demonstration. Ariel Sanchez indicated that there are some confused people who participated. However, what I'm saying today, I'd like to concentrate on one specific point, on the question of Canada. Now, in Canada, we have a very peculiar and unfortunate situation whereby the Canadian dimension that used to be an important voice of the American left in Canada has changed radically over a short period of time lately. Now, they are, for example, on Cuba, which is sort of a litmus test, in my view, whether you're progressive or left or whatever. The Canadian Dimension has published 2 articles from Cuban dissidents in their website. So I deal with both of them. Let's deal with one first. It's called La Joven Cuba, which was reproduced, their article reproduced in Canadian Dimension. They say, in the one-party model of bureaucratic socialism, of course, the real and spontaneous participation of citizenry in political activity is not allowed. This discriminatory condition explains why, faced with the July 11 social outburst, the party reacted with brutality in an authoritarian way rather than politically. Wait a second. A week after the event, a very important political act took place. Helen was there, she can vouch for that, whereby 100,000 people in Havana demonstrated in support of its president and the Cuban Revolution and against the counter-revolution. Now, this article in La Joven Cuba, published in Canadian Dimension, continues. Freedom slogans that swept the island indicate the demand of the citizenry to be recognized in a political process that has ignored them up to now. Now, wait a second. Where have you guys been? Where has La Joven Cuba been since 1959, after the Cuban Revolution overthrew a dictatorship, a neo-colonial stranglehold over Cuba, and began the process of developing real people's democracy, not just where citizens are just recognized, but where citizenry play an active role in their own revolution. Let's go on to their next gem. They say several governments and the European Union as a bloc have criticized the violent repression. Now, what were some of the other countries? Well, one of the other countries is Canada. So this puts the Canadian Dimension in a very difficult situation because in principle, they are very much against the Canadian government, against Trudeau and its foreign policy. But by copying and pasting what the dissidents have to say about Cuba, they open themselves they are in a very difficult situation because these dissidents, they love the Canadian government. They even more so love Trudeau just as much as they loved Obama before. So let's see what the Canadian government said about July 11th that has so much impressed these dissidents. On July 12th, the Canadian Foreign Affairs said, it is closely monitoring the situation in Cuba. concerned by recent events and urges all sides to exercise restraint and encourages all parties involved in the crisis to engage in peaceful and inclusive dialogue. Okay. July 15, Trudeau said, "We're deeply concerned by the violent crackdown on protests by the Cuban regime." Mr. Trudeau, do you not have diplomatic relations with Cuba? Why do you call it, suddenly calling it a regime in the same way that Trump and Biden does? Trudeau goes on, "We condemn the arrest and repression by authorities of peaceful demonstration. We stand with the people of Cuba who want and deserve democracy, freedom, and respect." How nice of Canada. Now, on July 23rd, a phone call took place between Canada's Foreign Minister, Marc Garneau, and Cuba's Foreign Minister, Bruno Rodriguez. And the readout of that event by the Canadian government is as follows. Canada expressed its deep concern over the violent crackdown on protests in Cuba, particularly the repressive measures against peaceful protesters, journalists, activists, and arbitrary detention. So this is the position of the Canadian government. Now, let us deal with the second important dissident group whose article has been published in full by the Canadian Dimension. This one is called On Cuba. Here's what they say. If after these protests, the government insists that the only way to channel this unrest is through, they put this, established channels, in practice, that means that the avenues for handling these conflicts and needs
1 minute, Arnold. 1 minute.
Closed off or unacceptably narrow. So I'll just close by saying this. The other thing that they say is that a social uprising occurs when society is already broken. This is very close to what Biden said, no? Saying that the Cuban state is a failed state. And the last thing I would like to say, it's important that this, what this dissident group said, that the words vandalism and criminals, these are words used by the Cuban government, have antecedents, for example, with what Chilean President Sebastián Piñera said, who also called people who demonstrated during social uprising as vandals and criminals. So here they are opening up a discussion, openly suggesting that Miguel Díaz-Canel is similar to dictators such as in Chile. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Arnold. That was really interesting and absolutely full of very important information. Our next speaker is Fiona Edwards. Fiona is co-founder and member of one of our sponsoring organizations, the organizing committee of the No Cold War campaign. And she is a journalist who focuses on progressive struggles in Latin America and on US policy, and on the US Cold War against China. She's also the editor of the Eyes on Latin America website and a national officer of the Stop the War Coalition in the United Kingdom, or in Britain, rather, sorry. Fiona, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Radhika, and it's a great honor to speak today amongst such brilliant company. I'd like to start by congratulating the Federation of Cuban Women, who this week celebrated their 61st anniversary. Today, 24,000 Cuban women medical professionals are present in over 40 countries across the world, providing healthcare to those in need during this pandemic. It is amazing to note that the majority of doctors and nurses serving in Cuba's international brigades are women. These women are fulfilling the promise made by Fidel Castro when he said, "Our country does not drop bombs on other people's. Our country's tens of thousands of scientists and doctors have been educated in the idea of saving lives. Doctors, not bombs." It is this spirit of internationalism and global cooperation that humanity needs right now, especially to overcome our common problems, saving lives by ending this devastating pandemic, making global poverty history, and stopping climate breakdown, which threatens us all. And yet the world's most powerful country, the United States of America, is shunning global cooperation. In defiance of global public opinion, the US is intent on waging a dangerous new Cold War against countries that aren't willing to submit to Washington's diktats, countries who only wish to exercise their right to determine their own futures and pursue their own path of national independence and development. This is exactly why Cuba is under increasing attack from the US. Just 60 years ago, the Cuban people chose an independent path and refused to submit to US colonial control. Ever since, the US has been intent on overthrowing the Cuban government. So, as the US military forces withdraw from Afghanistan, ending the 20-year war on terror, which has killed, injured, and displaced millions of people, we cannot say that the US government has drawn any lessons from this defeat, or that it regrets the immense human suffering US military intervention has caused. In fact, the US is becoming more aggressive. In particular, the US is focused on intensifying its Cold War against China, against Cuba, and also against other progressive forces in Latin America who are struggling for national sovereignty and social progress. With an annual military budget of $750 billion, yes, that's annual, and over 800 foreign military bases, 400 of which surround China, the US is moving on from its war on terror and is determined to stop the peaceful rise of China and the development of a multipolar world. Right now, Cuba is the focus of the US's attack in Latin America. And by punishing the Cuban people, the US hopes to send a threatening message to all those who stand up to Washington, that they will also be subjected to a Cold War if they resist the US's demands. The Cuban people understand more than anyone else in the world that the US administration is the greatest threat to world peace and prosperity. For 60 years, Cuba has endured US aggression, as all of the other speakers have outlined. It is estimated that the US blockade has cost the Cuban economy over $147 billion. It is absolutely disgraceful that the US, during the global pandemic, chose to make the Cuban people suffer more by tightening its blockade with further sanctions started by President Trump and continued and intensified by President Biden. The inevitable and deliberate consequence of this US aggression has been to produce shortages in vital medical supplies and food in Cuba. So much for this US support for human rights in Cuba. What utter hypocrisy to claim that they support human rights in Cuba. It is great that the majority of the world is opposed to this behavior from the US. In June, at the UN General Assembly, 184 countries voted against the US economic blockade of Cuba. Only 2 countries voted in favor of it. So the US has completely failed to win international support for its attacks on Cuba. And even the US's closest allies have refused to support them. Indeed, in response to the US's latest attempts to destabilize the situation in Cuba through the waging of an enormous international media campaign of disinformation and the imposition of further sanctions, in response to all of this, people all over the world have mobilized against the US to support Cuba. So Russia, China, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Mexico have all sent practical aid to Cuba. And also there is some significant support in the US itself against the US aggression against Cuba. In the New York Times, over 400 celebrities and organizations, many of them from the US itself, signed an open letter calling on Biden to let Cuba live and end US aggression. For centuries, the US has sought to dominate Latin America and the Caribbean, regarding the region as Washington's backyard. And unfortunately, this continues to be the case. However, the US does face major challenges because progressive forces across the continent are pushing forward in their struggle for self-determination. So in Peru, Castillo this year won the presidential election on a promise of using the country's national resources for the people's development. The sovereign and legitimate governments of Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba have successfully resisted US attempts to overthrow them against the enormous pressures of economic warfare and campaigns of destabilization. In Bolivia last year, the people overturned a US-backed coup against Evo Morales and the movement towards socialism. And in Brazil, former political prisoner Lula da Silva is free, cleared of all the fake charges of corruption that the US organized against him. And Lula now is currently having a lead 26% in the opinion polls ahead of next year's crucial presidential election in Brazil. This advance of progressive forces in Latin America is a blow not only to the US foreign policy that designates Latin America as its backyard, but to the US's determination to dominate global affairs. The fact that progressive forces in Latin America are increasingly pursuing win-win relations with China is regarded as very, very threatening development by the US Cold War hawks in Washington. China has become a major trading partner for most countries in Latin America. The US wants to stop this movement towards a multipolar world. China offers Latin American countries vaccines, trade, investment, and respect for sovereignty. That's the fundamental point. respect for sovereignty. This is a welcome alternative to the US coups, destabilization campaigns, and economic warfare. Just yesterday, it was reported that new supplies to help Cuba fight COVID-19 have been donated and arrived from China. What a stark contrast to the US approach of exacerbating the impact of the pandemic deliberately by applying more sanctions. This advance of progressive forces in Latin America and their growing links with China is completely intolerable to the US. And so I think that in addition to opposing the US's increasing aggression against Cuba, the world must be alert to the imminent threat of a US-backed coup in Peru, the threat of a serious destabilization campaign in Nicaragua ahead of the election in November. And we must be aware high-profile figures from the United States, such as Trump's former advisor, Steve Bannon, are already intervening into next year's presidential election in Brazil. They've got plans of a soft coup to keep the far-right President Jair Bolsonaro in office to stop Lula from claiming his democratic victory. The US Cold War in Latin America, in other words, is heating up, and Cuba will continue to be on the front line of US attacks. Just a final word. We must support Cuba's right to self-determination, sovereignty, and development. Opposing US aggression against Cuba, including all the sanctions and the illegal trade embargo, is the best way we can do that. This is not radical. It's simply just and in line with world opinion. It is also key for world peace and the struggle against the new Cold War. Let Cuba live.
Thanks so much, Fiona, for that very fine-grained picture of the balance of forces in Latin America and more broadly as well. It was very informative. Our next speaker is Manolo de los Santos, who is a researcher and political activist. He's worked in the Organization of Solidarity and education programs to challenge the US regime of illegal sanctions and blockades. He was also based in Cuba for some years, and he has been working on building international networks of people's movements and organizations. In 2018, he became the founding director of the People's Forum in New York City, a movement incubator for working class communities to build unity across historic lines of division at home and abroad. He also works as a researcher for the Tricontinental Institute and writes for the Globetrotter and People's Dispatch. Manolo, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika, for that wonderful introduction. I'm honored to join all of you. It's even a greater honor to be here among some of my own teachers, people who I've studied and read in this ongoing battle in defense of Cuba. I think everyone here has already spoken, I think, very clearly to the fact that there is an ongoing war against Cuba. There's a war against Cuba for so many reasons, because it has a socialist project, because it defends its sovereignty and independence, because Cuba in many ways is the base for the dreams and projects of justice around the world. But I would want to talk more specifically about the fact that this campaign of maximum pressure being waged by the Biden administration right now takes on, if not new characteristics, but uses more openly new weapons in its arsenal. The fact is that at this point, Cuba is not faced not just by economic warfare, which has been in place for close to 60 years now. Cuba is not faced only by the 243 measures imposed by the Trump administration, but there's a full set of war tools being used against Cuba right now that prey on the internal factors, the internal weaknesses and issues that Cuba faces every day. Struggles around organizing young people, issues around the internet, race, LGBTQ questions, gender, poverty, all being used to make or create the illusion that Cuba is a failed state. All used to create the idea that somehow in 62 years of revolution, Cuba has made no progress or has not advanced enough. According to the standards of who? I question the hypocrisy of the US government, but of the international, sometimes progressive forces who weigh Cuba or put Cuba on a pedestal that it doesn't necessarily need to be on. I actually want to defend Cuba's ongoing potential to achieve full social justice under socialism. I want to defend Cuba's right to make mistakes, to commit errors.
That's right.
The right of Cuba to actually live out its full promise of revolution, which means changing everything that must be changed, like Fidel often talked about, but recognizing that that is a popular process that has many steps forward as it does backwards. Right now, the ongoing threats around Cuba, so visibly seen on social media, on the internet, will seek to maximize or put greater focus on what seem to be Cuba's great weaknesses. But I celebrate these. I celebrate these because these actually demonstrate the vivaciousness, the resilience of the Cuban people. The fact that, yes, they're struggling to tackle racism. Yes, the fact that they're struggling to end homophobia and transphobia. It's a struggle to actually build a different world. And I'm willing to put my life on the line to defend that project. Because at this point, Cuba needs the world, but we need Cuba even more. Where would we be in our own projects of liberation if it wasn't for the Cuban Revolution? Where would we be without Cuba as consciousness of the world, constantly reminding us that healthcare is not a privilege, but a human right? Where would we be without Cuba as the lightning rod for new and invigorating projects for socialism around the world? All different in their approaches and their tactics and strategies. In many ways, I would often refer to Cuba as that old home for the Bolsheviks that re-energizes us and pushes us forward in today's struggle. Knowing that so much has been said already in this panel, wonderfully convened, that brings so many voices from around the world, I would only add to that call that says, let Cuba live. But in order for us to let Cuba live, it's not just about stopping or saying we are against the aggression of the US empire, but it's also about building the broadest movement possible of all the necessary forces on the planet willing to stand with Cuba. It often means that we will have to create the strategies that seem impossible in order to make sure that Cuba itself doesn't feel that it's alone, but also to remind empire, and not just the US, but Canada, Britain, and other leading forces on the planet, that we will not be willing to see Cuba sacrificed on their altar of capital. Just to end, I think about the next book that Vijay, Prashad, and I are editing, which is a selection of speeches by Fidel Castro in moments of crisis. It's coming out in a few weeks, and I hope all of you get a copy. But to me, one of the things I've learned the most just from editing the book, from rereading Fidel's speaking in those moments in which Cuba was being fiercely attacked militarily, seeing its young people being killed, seeing Cuba face the special period alone in many ways, seeing Cuba have to face the dark night of neoliberalism in Latin America. His constant optimism, his constant belief that we will turn all setbacks into victories is what keeps me here standing today with all of you and with Cuba. So I agree with my friends from No Cold War, from all the different organizations that are here, that we will not allow Cuba to be defeated. We will not allow Cuba to continue to be blockaded. We will not allow Cuba to continue to be silenced. We will stand with her always. Let Cuba live.
Thank you so much, Manolo. That was very inspiring. And I think you're basically telling us if you really want to support Cuba, it's not about just letting Cuba live, but also following the example of Cuba and standing up for our own economic sovereignty, for our own social justice, and supporting all those struggles. Thank you very much. So finally, the dessert on our wonderful 8-course intellectual feast will be Camila Escalante's remarks. Camila is the woman behind the Kawsachun News media outlet, which is based in Bolivia. And she's also known for her correspondent work around Latin America. Camila comes from a family of FMLN revolutionary former combatants. She has been based, among other places, in Quito, in Havana, and in Caracas. And she's currently based in Tropico of Cochabamba. and she reports on the campesino movements across the continent. She will be on the ground covering the upcoming elections in Nicaragua and in Venezuela. So Camila, please take it away.
Thanks so much for having me. I wanted to echo what we've already heard from Vice Minister Carlos Ron in Venezuela on the contributions and the presence of Cuban doctors around the world. Here in Bolivia, under the leadership of Evo Morales and the MAS government, they were able to better the conditions of Bolivians across the board through investment in infrastructure and social programs. But a country without specialized health professionals or with large regions without sufficient doctors can't train or form doctors as quickly as it can build roads. And for many people here, particularly the indigenous communities in areas like the one I'm in, like you said, the Tropico of Cochabamba, the Cuban doctors left a massive impression on the people and provided some of the only decent and dignified care people have ever received in their lives. And when we speak to people, they always talk about their experiences receiving medical treatment from the Cuban doctors during their time here. The doctors were expelled during the fascist coup, and the right-wing doctors associations continue to reject any suggestion of their return because they know that health services become less profitable when you have highly trained professionals committed to providing services to the best of their ability, under the belief that everybody should be able to access those services without barriers, without discrimination, and who carry the internationalist legacy of Fidel and the revolutionary Cuban people. So I've been covering Cuba in English for a number of years, now primarily for Kawsachun News, and I get a lot of questions about where English speakers can find the best information on Cuba. Our policy here at Kawsachun News has always been to go straight to the source. And so I wanted to share some of those sources quickly. So Cuba Debate has been one of my main sources for full transcripts of important speeches, such as the ones by General Raul Castro and President Miguel Diaz-Canel, and many other speeches and discourses from congresses and other key events. Oftentimes you'll find them in Spanish, but you can copy those and of course translate them through free online translators if they're not published in English, or if they're not yet published, translated into English. Granma is the official outlet of the Communist Party of Cuba's Central Committee that has also been key. It has a version in English as well as several other languages. Prensa Latina is the official state news agency of Cuba with a capacity to cover Cuba, Latin America, and the entire world with frequent news articles on its website, and which many international outlets and agencies do use. Telesur English is now beginning to operate in Havana, where I was based, with Telesur at the start of this year. The Agencia Cubana de Noticias is also one of the main state sources that can be a great source for photos, high quality photos of events, which you can find on their social media. There's a project called The Belly of the Beast. It's an outlet based in Havana, and I had the opportunity to meet with one of its founders this year. And they do more of video and multimedia, which is specifically made for an English-speaking audience, foreign audience, largely on social media. They have a YouTube channel. And last year, they released a series called The War on Cuba, which can be found on YouTube. There are many other great sources. Of course, everyone on this panel is a great source for Cuba information, but I'd also like to encourage everyone to locate and follow Cuba's scientific and medical research developments through the official pages of the Finlay Vaccine Institute, BioCuba Pharma, and the Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology. That's acronym CIGB. There are many others. The Minister of Health is Dr. Francisco Duran. And I would like to hopefully be able to publish such a page on our website, Kawsachun News, to be able to share some of those resources so that we don't have to rely on the mainstream press, which has been so misleading for so long on the developments in Cuba, because we have such a wealth of information in English and also coming from the United States. We've had some great projects media projects coming from outlets like Breakthrough News, even the People's Forum. These are things that Manolo is involved in, where you can find a lot of information from friends of Cuba and people who have spent a lot of time themselves doing solidarity work on Cuba. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Camila. We are at the end of our formal presentations and we are about to go into the question and answer session. I really look forward to it. Before we do that, may I please take a minute or two to tell you about an important political initiative that some of us have taken, so those of us in the International Manifesto Group. We have done what our name implies. We have published a manifesto for our times. If you like the remarks that were made today, I think you will love the manifesto. So to please take a moment to read it and perhaps sign it. I have put the URL in the chat, so please take a look at it. The manifesto is entitled Through Pluripolarity Towards Socialism, and it basically accepts the idea of the critical importance of things like economic sovereignty, of national as well as class struggles towards socialism. So please read it, please sign it if you like it, and if you like it, please also circulate more widely to all your friends, comrades, like-minded people and organizations. Thank you very much. So now we will take questions, and in order to put a question, please raise your hand using the raise hand function, which is for some people in the reactions little icon. It's under the reactions icon, or you will find it at the bottom in any case of your screen. So do I have any questions? I have John McGrath. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'm an American citizen living in the UK, and I've enjoyed this the talks today. I was wondering if I should put my energy into this congressional bill with Amy Klobuchar about ending the economic blockade. I know it doesn't have any language about Guantanamo Bay, and that it's drafted by people who are most interested in, selling wheat to Cuba, et cetera. It doesn't, it's not like I just want to know if you guys think that bill has any downsides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I think we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time and then open it up to the panel to reply. So I have a second question from Serge Ruski. Serge, please go ahead.
Heather, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, depending on where our esteemed panelists and attendees may be. My question is for MP Hazzard, but anyone can feel free to add on to this answer. I recently spoke with Cuba's ambassador to Canada, Josefina Vidal, and one of the things we discussed was the ample opportunities for investment in Cuba. With the United States seemingly withdrawing from the global stage, at least on some commitments, is this the right time for the United Kingdom and perhaps other countries? We have His Excellency Mr. Ron from Venezuela joining us as well to pursue closer economic ties with Cuba, or at the very least reassess them. Thank you.
That's great. And I have a third question from Nino Palicia. Nino, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for this amazing panel. For those of us who have been working in solidarity with Cuba, this is very inspiring. I want to refer specifically to a message that Manolo de los Santos gave us, and was in relation to building a strong international movement. And now this is, when we speak about Cuba, we're not speaking only against the blockade, the US blockade against Cuba, but we're also speaking against the intervention of other countries. Arnold referred to Canada specifically. So when governments deal with Cuba and other countries, that falls usually under the area of foreign policy. Now, in my experience, foreign policy is not necessarily at the forefront of people's minds in those countries. So it seems to me that our own maximum pressure in our own countries has to be in the area of foreign policy. And that is usually the least important from the people. Now, I would like a comment in relation to that and see how, in fact, we can mobilize actions focusing on foreign policy that would address specifically the issue we're talking about: Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, etc. Thank you.
Thanks, Nino. Those are some very important and I think quite practical questions. So who would like to take them first? I'm going to go to gallery view so I can see among the, Helen, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I want to address the question of both investments in Cuba and building, an opposition to US sanctions. So there's a few things to make clear. US sanctions on Cuba are unilateral. They are national laws. However, they massively impact and block Cuba's ability to engage with and trade with the rest of the world because of the power of the United States economy and particularly the leverage it has because the US dollar is the dominant currency. So in 2019, this is according to the Wall Street Journal, 88% of transactions were carried out, international transactions were carried out in the US dollar. And the US can prohibit or permit those transactions to take place. So you have this terrible dichotomy where on the one hand, countries like Britain and the whole of the European Union have legislation which make it illegal to implement United States sanctions, which are a domestic law, in an extraterritorial way. So it is illegal in Britain and the EU to fine individuals or companies for trading with Cuba. Even, we've seen that humanitarian medical donations to Cuba in the context of COVID-19 to help Cuba get ventilators and syringes are right now being blocked by US sanctions. Now, the question is, what do we do about it? Because our governments are being negligent. They are not implementing their own national legislation to stop this happening, to protect their citizens and entities. Now, I spoke to the EU ambassador in Havana a few years ago, and I raised this point. I said, there is legislation in the EU from 1996 in response to the illegal extraterritorial nature of the Helms-Burton Act. Why do you not implement that legislation? Why do you allow the US to stop Cuba trading with individuals and entities in Europe? And, his response was, yes, you're right, we should. We're not implementing our own laws. But the fact is that Cuba counts for 0.8% of EU trade, whereas the United States is our dominant trading partner. So I think this links to the question that you've raised, Nino. What can we do? We need very radical militant campaigns in our own countries to hold our own politicians and legislature to account. Essentially, if anyone here, for example, I'm in the UK and someone asked about UK investment, anyone here knows a corporate lawyer who's prepared to take a case, that's what we need. We need to test these laws. We need to take them through the courts, but we also need to do it while we're building a movement on the streets. Why did Obama go for rapprochement? He went for rapprochement because the heads of state of Latin America, even the right-wing ones, had clubbed together and said, we will no longer accept the unilateral sanctions and policy of the United States to block Cuba from Latin America. Cuba belongs back into Latin America. And so the political cost to Obama of keeping the status quo was higher for his administration than moving towards rapprochement. Very little was achieved. There is also a myth that the blockade was lifted. You know, people saying, "Oh, the blockade's been lifted." No, it wasn't. But the point is that we need to create scenarios in our own countries where the political cost for Britain, for the EU, for the Canadian government of allowing the US to impose illegally its unilateral sanctions is higher. It costs more for them. There is a movement to create problems for them than allowing it to carry on in the status quo. So, you know, it is so difficult to do anything with Cuba. I've mentioned sending donations. I'm trying to do a research project with a Cuban partner. And, you know, we got permission from the sort of academic side. It's all gone through. But our finance office is saying you can't do it because HSBC will not have any transaction with Cuba because it's been put on high risk because Trump maliciously, viciously, in days before he left, put Cuba back on that list of countries that support terrorist sponsors, state sponsors of terrorism. And, you know, we need to hold our governments and our financial institutions to account because this is illegal.
I think that's so important. Thank you, Helen. And it's important both in the case of Cuba as well as in the case of other countries that are being targeted, whether it is Venezuela or China or whatever. And I think what Helen recommends, that we have to make it more difficult for our governments to cooperate with the United States, is very, very important. Other speakers would like to respond to the three questions raised, particularly around Amy Klobuchar's bill and what we should make of it, and also other developments in Latin America. Anyone would like to go? Any of the speakers?
If I may, I think, you know, at this moment, I fully agree with Helen. You know, we have to make it unbearable for all governments, including the US government, to continue waging its war on Cuba. In that space, though, in the spectrum of what we do, I think all tactics are favorable. All forms of struggle are favorable. I personally don't believe that right now legislative projects in the US will advance very much to end the blockade or to even limit certain segments of the blockade. But if folks feel they can put pressure in Congress, go ahead. If folks feel that now is their time and they feel strong about sending aid to Cuba, let's do it. If it's doing open letters, if it's organizing activities, whatever it is, but we must do it. I think part of it is thinking about what Nino was talking about. Often there is a separation of, you know, what we call foreign policy issues from ordinary struggles or everyday struggles. I think we have to end that separation. And sort of that sort of depends also on expanding what I would call the Friends of Cuba group. All of us on this call are friends of Cuba, but Cuba needs more than just us as their friends. That means expanding that movement and broadening it to include the leading struggles of our moment, without asking them to surrender what they talk about or surrender their own agendas. But how do we actually bring together the agendas for Black liberation with Cuba's struggle against racism? How do we gather the best and the brightest of the fighters for justice around the world and for socialism around the world with Cuba's struggle for justice as well? I think that's sort of the need to broaden at this moment, and knowing that not one thing in particular will be the defining factor to end the blockade, but the summation, the accumulation of all these processes and all these forces united in struggle.
That's very important. Thank you, Manolo. I think, Chris, you wanted to say something, and then Arnold.
Yeah, thanks, Radhika. It's just in reply to Serge's question, really, about Ireland. And one of your commentators put into the chat a reminder that, yes, the EU's Economic Trade Commissioner at the minute is actually an Irish politician, Maria McGuinness. Ireland's obviously a small nation amongst the nations of the world, and certainly the EU. But there's an opportunity, I certainly believe, when it comes to the EU, to be using whatever leverage it has to try and reopen some of these discussions again. We've seen it, and it goes back to what Helen Manolo has just said, talking about using whatever leverage you can to try, and it is very often in courtrooms and on streets, to be able to open up the advantages. We have seen Irish industry start to do some really good deals with China in and around our agricultural and agri-food sectors. Ireland is well known across the world for world-class products whenever it comes to food and agriculture. So that there may well be possibilities there. I know that's certainly something the EU had been looking at previously in different parts of Latin America, but until, as Helen has said, until that battle is won when it comes to getting around the sanctions, it's very, very difficult to do that. There's also another point in that Ireland is now the only English-speaking member of the EU following Brexit. It's likely to become a pharmaceutical hub, given that the pharmaceutical companies are likely to relocate out of London in times ahead. That may open up an opportunity around Cuban biotech and biomedical opportunities, who knows? But I say, I go back to my comments at the start, until we win that battle to open up the trading alliances and to start to reassert some leverage against the United States, it's very, very difficult, especially for a small country like Ireland.
Thanks, Chris. And Arnold.
Yes, with regards to what do we do, I'd like to bring to the attention of everyone here that in Canada, there is an important petition by the New Democratic Party Member of Parliament, Nikki Ashton, which specifically calls on the Trudeau government to take a stand against the Trump sanctions. So I could send you the links to these petition, which can be signed by Canadians only. And that is, of course, in addition to that great work that is being done for Let Cuba Live, which is really an international petition. I'd just like to add one point, just in case people did not see the chat. I put in the chat box the full Ariel Sanchez YouTube with the subtitles. So if people missed it through the subtitles, I encourage you to go into the chat box, download it, and you can see his full interview right there. Thank you.
Thanks, Arnold. And yes, it will also be on our website later on. So please circulate it. Okay, are there any other of the speakers who wanted to respond to that first round of questions? Camila, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the suggestion and the call and the plea that, it's very important that all of us have such a close and ongoing and long relationship with Cuba and the Cuban people and all of our solidarity work. And I think it's very important to remember and highlight that young people don't always have these same opportunities because of the precarious nature of people's work, because of how difficult it is to get funding to go on these trips. A lot of times there's a lot of young revolutionaries in places like the United States and elsewhere who would love the opportunity to be able to visit a place like Cuba. Going to Cuba, absolutely, for the first time, a decade ago changed my life. I was young and very fortunate to be able to be, going to Cuba regularly all the time since then. And I think that a lot of times when you go on delegations and you go to these special meetings and things, you see some of the same people. And it is an incredible life-changing opportunity to be able to, spend your whole life reading and learning about these struggles, but to be able to go there yourself. And these sorts of opportunities are not available to everyone. And I just think that if we are in any capacity as organizations, if you're part of a communist party in your own country or some other type of solidarity organization, to always try to prioritize sending some of the youngest people to go as delegates, to go experience for themselves and make those exchanges, have those cultural exchanges and that learning experience there in Cuba. And it really does help to build and fortify this new generation of internationalists from a young age, because as much as we love seeing all of the same people in Cuba, every year on May 1st, and all these different events, it's very important to give people the opportunity to do that, to make sure that people aren't just solidarity activists over Twitter, that they're able to see and experience things for themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll go to our next round of questions. I have Tariq Rajaf. Please go ahead.
As a former, as a son of a former Algerian fighter for the founder for the movement for the independence of Algeria, we had a close relationship with Fidel Castro and his movement. As a matter of fact, he visited Algeria on several occasions. My belief is that Cuban people have to be united. All of them have to be united, and it includes the diaspora. So how does the international movement for the assistance to Cuba manages to relate to these folks in Miami that have been at the base of most of the American policies in the last 60 years, because they are frustrated people that left, but now we're talking about a third generation. How can we create a program, establish a movement to change the mind of these people down there so that they can rejoin their own folks, their people, against the imperialism of the United States?
Thank you, Tarek. And I have Serge has a follow-up question. Go ahead, Serge, please.
Yeah. I'll just follow up on a slightly different topic, but one that I think is very important as well. And I should also take the time to identify myself. I'm the Canadian correspondent with Sputnik News. This is for Mr. Ron. Recently, a Canadian outlet, the Canadian Dimension, published an op-ed titled "The Lima Group is Falling Apart," in which the author said, and I quote, Latin American governments are abandoning the controversial regime change alliance. Now it's time for Canada to follow suit. It is a sentiment that some Canadian parliamentarians have echoed as well. Is it, as you know, Canada is in the midst of an election. Is it time for the next government in Ottawa to reassess relations with Venezuela? And if so, why?
Thank you, Serge. So maybe perhaps we will begin with you, Carlos. I think you're still muted.
Sure. Yes, sorry. Okay. No, look, I think the Lima Group is something that should have never even existed. It's something that's it was purposely created in order to overthrow a government or to promote the destabilization of an entire nation. And as time has gone by and that attempt has not been successful to overthrow the Venezuelan government, then what we see is that many of those governments who at the beginning thought they were going to be successful at doing so have even lost themselves their spaces in some of their countries, and are now faced with this ridiculous, absurd position where they try to defend and uphold a government that has no basis in any legal, has no legal basis in Venezuelan constitution or in the Venezuelan political system, which is that supposedly parallel government that they established with Juan Guaido. As negotiations move forward within the Venezuelan government and the different types of oppositions that we face here, what we see is that the Guaido-led opposition is even more and more left out and left behind. So again, I think it's a lesson for everybody throughout the continent that you cannot impose a change of government on Venezuela or on Cuba or on any other where there's a popular backing of such governments. Our decisions have to be made by our peoples, not by impositions from outside. The best route for these governments would be to simply recognize what the will of the Venezuelan people is and accept, our democratic structures. And in practice, whatever they decide to do or not, you could tell that by now they've lost a lot of ground. They've lost that effort of using the Lima cartel as a group of pressure against Venezuela. Did not work, did not succeed. Today, the Guaido idea of a government is even more isolated than ever. And as a matter of fact, if you see in the dialogue that's going on in Mexico, there's clearly a document where it says one side is the government of Venezuela and the other side is a unity platform of an opposition. So there's no another government of Venezuela. So again, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of resources from the countries represented in that group. And it's deemed for failure because you can't overthrow what the people really want for their nations.
Great, thank you. Any other speakers would like to take up these questions of anti-imperialist solidarity of Helen, please? Yes.
So just for the first question there about the, the situation in with Cuban Americans, as they're called, or Miami community. I mean, people should be aware that there is an probably unprecedented movement now among Cuban Americans to demand an end to the US blockade or embargo, as they call it, and for restoration of the ability of families to send remittances, which is almost impossible now, and to visit each other. And there's, really important work being done by a Professor Carlos Lasso. So check him out, add that to the list of media outlets where you can get information. And they've started to do this thing, which is called the Caravana. So I think it's the last Sunday of every month. People get together. In the US, it tends to be in cars. I think in the UK, we've used bicycles and to get together monthly and, either go on long walks or drives and hold up flags and say, end the US blockade of Cuba. So actually, rather than us trying to influence that community, that those actions, those mobilizations that have now taken off throughout the United States have mobilized people around the world. So we're now joining in with those activities. Puentes de Amor, thank you for whoever's just posted that in the chat. This is also linked to the dozens of organizations around the world, including in the United States, that are raising money to, give Cuba something back after those statistics that I read, how many lives have been saved and improved by Cuban medical professionals, a result of the revolution's investment in education and healthcare, the prioritization of social welfare, which, as we've been saying, is an example, the threat of a good example to neoliberalism, yes, but let's be honest, capitalism and the whole concept of private interests and private accumulation of social wealth. So there is a movement, and we can join those those Cuban Americans are brave. They are facing attack. There is unbelievable vicious campaign targeting of anyone who sticks their head out in the United States to call for a change in policy. So we should be uniting with them. And we should also be clear that the predominant demand in the United States, not just among the citizens in general, but among Cuban Americans, is now for an end to the US sanctions and a return to rapprochement, or at least an improvement and a reversal of these very punitive, mean sanctions that the Trump administration introduced and Biden has now augmented.
Thanks, Helen. Is that a hand up I see, Arnold? Would you like to say something?
Yeah, just in response to Sergio's question with regards to the Lima Group and Ron Carl's excellent answer, I'd just like to add that when I saw that news, I tweeted, "This is excellent news. It's a victory for the Maduro government and for the Venezuelan people." And the actual negotiations took place, but it was very disappointing that Canada, who was always supposed to be in favor of a peaceful resolution, rather than recognizing and just say that's fine, they had to add their own 2 cents. That is, what we need is presidential elections, new elections, democracy, and all that, which is not at all in the memorandum of agreement between Venezuela and the opposition. So one other gripe that I have against the Canadian government, for which I cannot resist from telling the truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arnold. Are there any other interventions from the floor or from the speakers? Anyone going once, going twice? Okay, well, I think we can very happily bring this extremely stimulating set of conversations or conversation to a close. I think we've heard a lot about the vanity, the incoherence, but at the same time, the destructiveness of American imperial policy. And we have heard also about the resilience of Cuba and of other countries fighting American imperialism, and how critically important it is to match that with popular struggles around the world. And I think that this is the key message. Once again, let me say that if you like these themes of imperialism and anti-imperialism and of resistance to them, etc., please do take a look at our manifesto. I've just shared, one second. I'm just sharing the the link again. Please take a look at that. And for the rest, let me just say thank you very much to all the speakers. I think it's a sign of how meaningful it was what you were saying, that we have had so many people still sticking around till the very end. So thank you very much. And please keep an eye on the International Manifesto Group's events, and those, of course, of all our sponsors, the No Cold War Campaign, the Black Agenda for Peace, the Tricontinental, and the Canada Files. Thank you very much, and see you again very soon. Bye-bye.